went straight to he is particularly good at distilling. I'll read the whole sentence later. So, our speaker today, Venky Vembu, is the Associate Director of the Hindu Business Line. A versatile journalist, during the past 30 years he has served almost all genres of journalism, dailies, fortnightlies, even digital products. He is a mathematics graduate and a self-trained economist, but writes knowledgeably on just about any subject. He has been deputy editor at different times of both Outlook Traveller and Outlook Money in New Delhi. He has served as editor of firstpost.com in Hong Kong and as foreign correspondent of the Bombay-based DNA in Hong Kong. Venky for several years was assistant editor of Frontline in Chennai and chief sub-editor of the Indian Express in Chennai. He is particularly good at distilling macroeconomics for the layman. He covered the 2008 financial crisis from Hong Kong with both insight and foresight. Venky will speak to us today about the social media phenomenon. Both social media and technology advances in TV and internet have affected the oldest media, newspapers. He believes that newspapers should focus on getting better. Readers too should develop healthier reading habits and tastes. This will encourage good and responsible journalism. Are newspapers dead? Venky will tell us.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. Secretary, Mr. Madhu. Thank you for having me over and all the Rotarians here. See, the way I wanted to frame it was, I was going to ask a provocative question. I'm going to address the point of whether newspapers are dead or are they dying. For the simple reason that a lot of old world practices in the newspaper business are going out of style, and new ways of doing journalism are coming to the fore. Just before we began here, I was having a chat with Mr. Madhu's son Mukan, and he expressed himself that he said he was a votary of what he calls the non-traditional media sources. Well, I just have to say one thing. I had a PowerPoint presentation made, and I had it done here, but I did it on a format which is incompatible with the format here. So there are still some things about which is to be said about the old world of doing things. So I probably should have just got printouts of the presentation. In any case, the point I wanted to make was that newspapers have had a good run up until now. They've been like almost treated like the gospel. The printed word is treated like a gospel. It had a certain respect and veneer for it. But now gradually it's come to pass that because of technology that's overtaking it at super fast speed, they are losing some of their the pedestal that they were put on is being knocked off systematically. And what I worry as an old world journalist is that not all the when we have to go to the dictates of technology, not all the changes that are happening are for the better. And we hope to make it an interactive session, so in case you want to provoke me by standing up for other ways of doing things, I'm happy to be provoked. So I'm afraid I don't have a PowerPoint presentation to go with. But I was going to talk about journalism in the era of social media. So to give a context, this is not the first time that traditional journalism, that's print journalism, has faced challenges. It has happened in the case of when television came in a big way, not necessarily here. I mean abroad. It came abroad much before it came here. Television has a sense of immediacy. You get the news instantly, and visuals tell some stories far better than narratives can. And for that reason, many people felt that traditional print media was already dead. As the song goes, the video killed the radio star. So every successive technological leap that happens, people always are fast to write the obituaries of the previous generation of technology. So it's while television journalism, when it took off, did change the way newspapers had to function, because they no longer cater to breaking news. The news that they would typically have carried the next day is already stale. So television did change newspapers, the way they went about their business. But I don't think they effectively killed it for the reason I'll wade into it for some reasons. Television has also with all its merits, television journalism has also dumbed down the business of news, for instance. As anyone who's watching to the 9 o'clock news programs will tell you, typically news is becoming entertainment on television, and that's the lack of sobriety that bothers me as an old world journalist. So that was one thing. So one of the challenges that traditional print journalism faces is from television. But I don't think that the problem is is so serious that it'll kill print journalism. The second, and of course this is very important, is the internet. At the advent of internet, what it did was to open up the borders of news flows. So sitting in front of your computer, you could have access to various news sources from all over the world in a way that that sort of democratized the news access to news. So what the downside of that, of course, was that the element of there's always say what makes news. What happens at a local level makes far more newsworthiness than something that happens. So supposing, just to illustrate the point, supposing there's an accident, and in fact, typically we cite accidents because no news is good news. So supposing there's an accident and 5 people die. If it happens in a far corner of South America, it doesn't make news here. But if it happens in our own city, that's bigger news. So proximity is one of the things. So when you're reading about news from other corners of the world, there's a lot of news that comes in which has no relevance to you. So the provincial news is far more important in that scale of things. So what the internet did was also created a whole generation of non-traditional journalists and journalism in a genre. The blogs were the first to take off much before the news, the social media, which I'll address later, happened. The blogs took off for the first time, and some of the bloggers became celebrities. They had far more of a following. They were individual people. There were sometimes people sitting in their basement who were just churning out opinion pieces, not necessarily doing on-the-spot reportage and so on. So they became opinion makers, and they enjoyed far more credibility because they were perceived to be, independent. So in that sense, it was we always talk of newspapers and even television as top down. The information flow is from the top to the bottom. One person sitting in a studio disseminates information, and millions of others catch it. But in this particular case, it was one person sitting in his basement, perhaps, and he could touch people in far corners of the world, and that sort of changed the narrative style from broadcasting, as we used to call it. It became narrowcasting. So one person is, the station was there. So, but that also comes with a problem, which is that in mainstream media, and I mean television as well as the print media, there is a rigorous editorial process that's undergone. So there are editors who vet copy. That is to say, we process it and to see whether it passes the test, the smell test, does it ring true, and all of that. Critics of mainstream media will always say that some editors have failed in their role, which is probably why there's a huge backlash against the mainstream media, including the print media today. But there is something to be said for the editorial rigor that happens in a mainstream news organization, which is lacking in all these non-traditional media spaces. So you never know. Whether a blogger. So, and also, over time, what has happened is newspaper organizations and print media have established some certain conventions in terms of disclosure of their interests. So, in the Hindu, where I work currently, we have a very rigorous editorial policy where we have to disclose our interests in, for instance, if I'm writing for a company, we have to internally disclose our interests. If I'm a shareholder in a company, I have to disclose it to them. So I cannot typically, that's to avoid conflict of interest situations. But you never know when it's an independent blogger or a non-traditional media source, you never know what drives their interests. They don't have to, they're not required statutorily to make any disclosures. So that's one of the things. Credibility is one of the things that that worked so well in the traditional media space, which is lacking in the non-traditional media space. That's one of the things. I was going to illustrate some instances of what also happens in a non-traditional media space, which is that they, particularly in the internet medium, which is that what has happened is that there's a chase for headlines, because that's what drives revenue. Everything is premised on showing up large volumes of traffic to your website. So this phenomenon of what's called clickbaiting, that is, you give provocative headlines in the hope that people will click and come to your site, and then you can bullshit whatever you want. My apologies for my French, but you can get away with practically anything. So the clickbaiting, I had some illustrations to show you. So the whole point about it is that the due rigor that would have gone into a process is missing again. To reiterate that point, that's one of the drawbacks of non-traditional media sources. And what the mobile phone, Mr. Madhu wanted me to specifically address the point of mobiles. Mobile telephones, what it did was to open up new channels of dissemination of news. It didn't change the way journalism works, but what it did was to give access instantaneously to many different sources. And although newspapers and traditional, even videos, for instance, also print, even television was influenced by it, they found an additional channel of communication, of reaching their audiences. Even the mobile telephone didn't change the way journalism worked. It just opened up a new channel for dissemination of news. The third aspect of the third challenge that typical traditional news media faced was in the social media space, and by which I mean avenues, platforms like Facebook, Twitter. I wonder if there is anyone here who accesses their Facebook for their primary means of information. Mukund, you said you might be one.
Maybe not my primary means, but I think it's something that exists today that wasn't there.
Okay. So typically what happens is, you may be reading a mainstream news article, but the channel through which it comes is through a social media platform, for instance Facebook or Twitter. And the reason why it happens is increasingly mainstream newspapers and mainstream news organizations are also figuring out that they found a channel of reaching audiences, a platform through which you can reach newer audiences, probably younger audiences. And again, it's enhanced the range of audiences that traditional media organizations can reach. But there is a downside, and I will address it a little later. There is a downside again. And so to be fair, the social media space platform has provided, it has its pluses as well as its minuses. Pluses work good for businesses. So in marketing initiatives and all of that, it's been demonstrably proved that the social media platforms are a way for you to reach out to customers, potential customers, and also redress customer grievances. The examples of Ola and Uber, instantaneous responses, and I myself have used some of them. So if they overcharge me, I reach out to them on Twitter and they instantly reverse the charges, almost instantly they do. So this replaces the old way of doing things. So technology, social media platforms have definitely enhanced the way businesses leverage the work that they do. But in the media space, there's one problem with what happens, which is that typically what happens is they always say Facebook is about the people you went to school with, and Twitter is about the people you would have liked to have gone to college with. So you can follow keen minds that you follow, that you admire, and all of that. But what happens typically is that we end up following people, and correct me if I'm wrong, we end up following people with whom we sort of identify, perhaps at the political level or at the social level. We are not open to hearing another point of view. So this has what is called a filter, a bubble. We tend to see the world through a tunnel vision, So that typically happens. And friends on Facebook, typically they will be posting articles that appeal to them. And if you are like-minded, you will forward it on to others and all that. So the point I'm trying to make is that social media platforms like these tend to put us in a certain bubble out of which it is difficult to break free unless you make a conscious effort, which if you do, it's a fair game. But if you don't, then you are trapped in a filter bubble and you don't even know it because you're only talking to like-minded people. And this has a way of shaping your worldview, not always for the better. Yeah, that's one of the points I wanted to make. Yeah. Recently, so what happened is Facebook recently what it did was it has Facebook as a function. It's called the news trending feature. That is to say, it picks up what are the articles that people are clicking on, and then it says this is trending, and so that it feeds you that as something that you might want to see. That again is a reiteration of already established views, for the reason that again the problem arises because of clickbaiting, as I said. So there is no substance in there may not be substance in what is being disseminated widely, but simply because somebody else has done it and it comes into your radar, and then because you like what you see, you forward it and all of that. There is no editorial process that goes on. It was there until very recently in Facebook. But what Facebook did was very smartly try to say what humans are irrelevant. So and then they introduced an algorithm to say, listen, anything that humans can do, machines can do better. And what it did was, Facebook did was to introduce an algorithm which would self-select these articles that would come into your news stream, for instance. And immediately the limitations of that process became evident. That is to say, the algorithm could not distinguish between authentic news and fake news. So as a result, all kinds of, simply because it was popular, it was feeding it into your news stream. You had no idea whether the news that you were reading was authentic or fake. And if it conformed to your broad worldview, you would identify with it and forward it. You would not spike it at that stage. You would not say this is something that is obviously fake and so on. So that is one of the limitations of depending excessively on social media platforms to filter or to act as our news filters, because as I said, they put you in a tunnel vision process where you don't see or typically see less of views that are contrary to your point of view. And again, the process of vetting the authenticity, waiting for authenticity is gradually giving way to to a certain machine, what shall I say, a machine-driven process which has its limitations. So that was one thing. Yeah. So then I wanted to address the economics of newspapers to go to the point. How much time do we have? 10 minutes. To address the point of why newspapers are in a crisis and what they can do about them. Yeah. So for all these reasons that I mentioned, that television is breaking news faster, and the newspapers, if they just went to the same commodity the next morning, they're behind the curve. So news has become a commodity, and people who consume news, as a consumer, I don't care whether the news comes to me from XYZ process, so long as it's authentic. It doesn't matter to me if it's coming on television, if it's coming from a newspaper or from a social media platform, so long as it's breaking news. And Mukund mentioned the point that if there's an accident site, somebody who's on the spot can put up a YouTube video instantaneously. He doesn't have to be a journalist. You can be going, but you see something interesting, you can upload it. News on your organization may pick it up. So that becomes a process. So everybody, technically, what the technology revolution did was that it made journalists of everyone. So that's a good thing, in the sense that you don't have to rely on old ways of doing things. And even newspapers, they didn't have to always be on the spot to be able to do that. Supposing there's a man on the spot who's doing a better job, I'd rather get it from them.
You can rest your case. Arnab Goswami is a journalist.
No, I'll come to Arnab in a minute. Yeah. So news is commodity. See, the problem with newspaper, economics of the newspaper is that if I gave you 16 pages of newsprint without printing anything in it, just gave you 16 pages of newsprint in it, can anybody guess what I might have to sell it for? what it might cost. I'm just selling it at cost price.
25 rupees?
Sort of. Because of the newsprint is kind of expensive. Add to that the printing cost and the labor cost and all those costs that go in. Newspapers, I would have to sell it to you at like, yeah, 60, 70 rupees. But they're being subsidized by the advertisements that newspapers carry. And therefore you are able to buy it for 3 rupees or some cases 1 rupee. Invitation prices are 1 rupee and all of that. But this makes for a very flawed economic model for newspapers for the simple reason that if you think of them as legs of a stool, one stool is disproportionately long. That is, the ad revenue that comes for newspapers is disproportionately more than subscription base. That's a very unstable arrangement for the reason that it makes newspapers beholden to the corporates that advertise with them. So, for instance, if I'm a newspaper editor and I find that there's a marketing interest in a certain company, so that certain company is willing to invest in me, it's entirely possible that the Chinese wall that we speak of between the editorial and marketing may be breached. If I have a story that's critical of the news media, of the company, it's entirely possible that I will come under marketing pressure, and we do come under such pressure. And a good editorial department will be able to beat back those kind of pressures. And it's fair to say that not all media organizations observe this in this Chinese wall arrangement. In fact, I can't talk about it without talking about what's called the paid news. What has happened is the news process has become corrupted by the fact that even news spaces can be bought with money. Even the newspapers, I'm not talking about advertisements now. News spaces can be bought with money in certain newspapers, which if you are a diligent reader, I won't need to name them at all. So, how this happened, it's a very interesting example of how this came about. The Virgin Group chairman, Richard Branson, he was asked once why he did all this. He's a flamboyant businessman. He used to jump out of airplanes. He used to do spectacular things, go on solo flights around the world, put his own life at risk. So he was asked why he did all these foolhardy things, putting his life at risk in many cases. And he said, I'm a businessman, and doing all this actually gives me great advertising value. I don't have to pay for good advertising. I get it free. And that's the principle that drives that had the, the effect of paid news for this reason. So Times of India in its wisdom decided that it will not, why should I give my new spaces for free? Because he's using, Richard Branson and others like him are using my platform to build their brands. So why cannot I monetize that? Therefore, Times of India at one phase went through a program where they would not acknowledge brands that did not advertise with them. In the news space, I'm talking about in the news space, they would blot out brands, names, and there were some bizarre things that were happening there. So these are also the ways in which the mainstream media lost a bit of its credibility for sure. I mean, it's a basket of eggs, and you don't know which one is rotten. And unless you're a discerning reader, you will not even know that you're being conned. So that was one of the.
But even channel news is paid for.
Sorry?
Even channel news is paid for.
When you say channel news, do you mean television?
Yeah.
Television typically is advertiser. As an advertiser, they come in.
No, like
I'm talking about
this paid news in the print media.
Yeah.
It's also there on channel.
It is, but if you mean, say there are areas where, see, for instance, again, I'll give you an example in my own newspaper. If I accept hospitality from X company, and I cannot do it independently of myself, I have to go through the organizational structure. Supposing a company invites me to come to their factory and they host me and they show me the facilities, and for the idea of writing about it, we don't typically accept invitations like that. But if they do, for some reason, if they say they're taking along so many journalists, in the print media space, we disclose it specifically. We were hosted by this particular organization for this, and so we disavow any conflict of interest in that particular case. So in the I used to work in travel journalism earlier, so I used to be a travel writer, and there again, for this reason that Outlook did not have the capacity, or it was not the profit-making machine, so we would accept hospitality from tourism boards. So again, we would say that we were hosted by. So if you make a full disclosure of things, at least it mitigates the problem. I'm not saying it takes it away. So long as you these are all, what shall I say, even certainly shadow lines, so you can violate them and you can con people for a while, but at some point you'll be outed. So I think disclosure is one way of getting around that problem that typically the organizations face. So how did newspapers evolve? I'll just take 5 more minutes here. How did newspapers evolve in response to all these challenges? What did newspapers do to change the way they one of the things was they moved away from the business of breaking news. So breaking news was not so much a priority because the news is already broken. So we came up with what is called, there was a breaking views program. That is, increasingly newspapers also entered into the digital space, that is the internet space. So they would have a footprint online and a more traditional presence. And so these views, this breaking news may happen on the website, but they wouldn't. In the news that came out the next morning, we would try to take it forward in some way to give some context to what was happening, and probably in the space of analysis or speaking to others to get some perspective on these things. So that's one of the things. So we moved away from breaking news to breaking views. So that's one way in which newspapers reinvented themselves. This also changes the way a newsroom works, and that's typically what happens is newspapers would go to bed, as we call it, by the end of the day. So it's the evening when the maximum work gets done. So if a story breaks in the morning, typically in an earlier time, we would wait till the evening and then process it and then put it on. So now there's a convergence happening between the digital space and the offline space, which is that first the news gets uploaded on the website and then we add layers to it subsequently, hopefully provide some additional value. So there are effectively what happens is the journalist ends up doing 2 or 3 different functions. One on the digital space, one perhaps if they have a multimedia space, perhaps even a a YouTube video, and then provide some analysis, additional layers of analysis for the print space. So, but I think the bread and butter of newspapers is what used to be called, and it continues to this day, the investigative journalism, which is the bread and butter of the organization. That's what distinguishes you. Instead of providing news as a commodity, I'm going to be, when I'm saying I'm breaking news, I don't mean news as such, but I'm doing some groundwork that others haven't done, therefore I'm able to break news stories. So if you find, you'll find that even today, investigative journalism hasn't gone completely out of fashion. If you noticed, the Indian Express recently had an article on the, there was a whole lot of chatter about whether this surgical strikes did happen at all and did not happen, and there was a whole lot of people expressing skepticism of the government's point of view and even the army's point of view. So Indian Express came out with an article, I don't know how many people got it, which is to establish the fact based on interactions with people on the other side of the line of control, to say that yes, they did take place at a certain time. Yeah, it was one of those, even here it's mostly based on hearsay, so it's not the gold standard for investigative journalism, but it happens all the time. And if you noticed, if in the international context, 2 new stories that broke just last week. One of them was the Trump video, where he's seen boasting about his sexual prowess and conquests and all of that. And that broke again in Washington Post, which is again a traditional media outlet. They didn't wait for the news for the next day. They put up the video on their website. It was one of the biggest stories in recent times in terms of reader interest and all of that. And so that kind of investigative journalism still thrives And New York Times had another one on Donald Trump's tax returns. They went back and dug out his tax files from, or they were actually, somebody in Trump Tower delivered it to them in a package. So they were able to establish the fact that he was writing off losses. No criminality was established because the laws allow you to do it. But he was unwilling to even put it in the public domain. So what I'm trying to say is that newspapers do still have a relevance. Traditional newspapers do still have a relevance when they do these kind of stories that take forward a story. Yeah, so our newspapers dead. It's fair to say that the revenue model is flawed. So a newspaper that relies excessively on corporate advertisements will typically be beholden to corporate interests, and that's a very unhealthy arrangement. So one of the things is that in response to all these challenges of technology and new media platforms, abroad, of course, a lot of newspapers are shutting down editions. They are laying off staff, and also cutting back on stories, long gestation stories that would typically take a long time. But for that reason, they'll be well researched. So immediacy has replaced a certain, which I would say is going the other way, because they can never compete with digital media platforms on immediacy. So there's a case to be made that even traditional media spaces should have gone the other way. But that's one of the knee-jerk responses that's flawed. Abroad, I'm talking about abroad. But last year, New York Times, which is a traditional media company, its digital subscription exceeded print. The revenue from digital subscription exceeded its revenue from print subscription. But the backbone on which that happens, if news were just a commodity and New York Times were just purveying news that you can get anywhere, they cannot go to. They behind a paywall, they give you up to 10 stories, 10 articles a month for free. So if they were not offering exclusive content, they would not be able to monetize their digital presence. But the fact that it's happening establishes that New York Times is able to, at the back end, provide content that's exclusive enough that people say, I will want to subscribe to it. It's not a news commodity. It's actually I derive some value from it. So newspapers must be able to offer exclusive content, even on their online spaces, to be able to be able to survive. The on-the-ground situation in India is vastly different. Unlike newspapers abroad, to a fair extent, the Indian newspaper industry is still growing at about 8% per year, which is not fantastic. But given the fact that elsewhere newspapers are shutting down, here in India, newspaper circulations are actually increasing, particularly in Tier 2 cities and Tier 3 cities, and in the regional media space. That is to say, non-English media space, their circulations are still increasing. What accounts for this? I think the increasing literacy is driving wider circulation of newspapers. Number two, there's a certain aspirational quality to having a newspaper. Newspapers are still perceived as opening a window to another world, which will give them economic benefits down the road. So parents want their children to read the newspapers, and all of that happens. And internet penetration is, of course, lower in India than it is elsewhere. So what's happening in the Indian media space is slightly different from what happens at the international level. So, yeah. So in that sense, in India particularly, television is not cannibalizing print journalism. It's actually what they call, it's having what they call there was a peculiar phrase that I came across which I'm trying to trace. Now what happens is typically is people watch television and then they just give them the news, but for some perspective they still look to traditional media sources, particularly in small towns and all of that, in Tier 2, Tier 3 cities. Print, television, far from cannibalizing print, is feeding print in a certain way. It's hard to explain, but it's one of those things that happens on the ground. They call it the appetizer effect. That is to say, people sample it on television and then they come to print for that. So that's also one aspect of the fact that print journalism continues to enjoy a certain credibility. Some of it is misplaced, as you will see, but I'll conclude by saying only that newspapers in India, the model, as I said, is flawed. The revenue model is flawed. So one of the ways in which they have to be able to to redress that problem is to be able to, number one, they have to offer a better product, they have to up their game. But it also needs readers to be better informed readers. That is to say, they must be able to make out, distinguish between good journalism and good journalism that's, that's not so great. And to be able to patronize products that are offering them good content. New digital products are coming up. Just last week, a new business digital publication called the XIII opened up. It's driven entirely by subscription, and in fact, the cost of their subscribing to their service, they provide you one business story a day. The cost of their subscribing to their service is like 2,700 rupees, which is almost the same as I would pay a New Yorker or an Economist magazine. But I think I think as good readers owe it to themselves to be able to invest in products that are trying out new things in the space, for the reason that if you don't do it, you as a reader are going to lose out in the longer run. You have to be able to make the investments in the short term in good journalism to be able to benefit from it. And that's largely my point, that good journalism needs an informed reader who's willing to put his money in the support of good journalism. I think I'll rest my case, and I'm happy to take questions on this. Yeah.
Editorial process in TV news.
Yeah.
Was it taken from press when TV news originated, or did it go through a process of maturation over time?
In India, as you probably know, the television took off in '75, right at the middle of emergency. So, not the best of models for editorial process, because it was a propagandist vehicle. Doordarshan was a propagandist vehicle. So there was not so much emphasis on editorial rigor. So, and then ever since it opened up, I think Asian Games '82 was when they sort of opened up marginally, and then Star TV, when 1990, 91 was when explosion in televisions happened in a major way. NDTV started up in the mid-80s and all of that. So, but again, it was initially when NDTV operated, it had a program called The World This Week, which beamed on the Doordarshan channel. So, I don't think at the initial stage there was no editorial process that was in the same way that the press had. Indian media print media has been traditionally free, independent, and therefore these arrangements were worked out over successive generations. But in the television space, it happened only after 1991, and this is the point that I was making, which is that even today, you may disagree with the news that we see on television, particularly with channels that tend to go over the top with their coverage. But there is an editorial rigor. Their biases show through, yes, but there is an editorial process that's undergone. And to answer your question, it did not evolve from the print medium. It had to work out its alternative arrangements because its origins lay in a different space.
It has matured over time.
It has matured over time.
So can we hope that the social media also, at least the larger networks, will also mature over time?
Valid point. But again, for the reason that, see, one of the things is that even traditional media organizations are in the social media space. They see it as a platform for them to disseminate it. So New York Times also leverages Facebook and Twitter and all of that. Excuse me. So traditional media organizations leverage the social media in a certain way, and that's just an extension of their many dissemination channels. I'm talking about non-traditional media outlets, that's to say a blogger sitting in his basement. He doesn't have to abide by any rules. He's not bound by any rules. And in recent times, you may find that when you look at the big picture, even entire how did Brexit happen? I mean, it was large-scale dissemination of misinformation about the consequences of migration and economic prospects and all of those things. So in a sense, even mainstream media was suckered. I mean, they were conned into doing this. And what Donald Trump is doing in America is much the same. Even mainstream media have been fooled. I'm not saying that the mainstream media is infallible, but there is a due process that limits the downside of these things.
So I think from what you said, and maybe you were kind of handicapped because of the absence of
Yeah,
the
that's-
patient. I'm seeing a lot of overlap